All right, cool. So hi everyone, thanks so much for tuning in to this live Q&A. My name is Liz Eggleston. I work on Course Report, which is a resource for finding the coding bootcamp that's right for you. So Course Report has the most complete directory of bootcamps around the world. You can use it to find schools that fit all of your needs. Check out our blog for interviews with students and instructors and founders at bootcamps across the world. We've got application tips, webinars like this, and tons of other really cool resources. So I am really excited to start this webinar today. Last month we hosted a webinar about iOS development and whether you should be learning Objective-C or Swift. Spoiler alert, you should learn both. It was really popular and informative, and since I get so many questions that are sort of similar about web development, things like which language should I start with, is one language better or worse or different than others, we decided to host this webinar where we're going to give you an intro to 3 different programming languages and learn which makes each unique. So helping us dive into this subject today are Lance and Spiros, who are both instructors at Coding Dojo, which is a full-stack bootcamp in Seattle, Silicon Valley, and then they just opened a campus in LA as well. And they have an online option also. So we are going to cover LAMP stack, mean stack, and Ruby on Rails, and we're going to do it in that order. So you can ask questions throughout the next 30 or 40 minutes, and we will do our best to answer them. Maybe you've heard that like one language is better for beginners, but you're not totally sure. Maybe you have a specific project or even like a specific job in mind, and you want to know which technology would work best for that goal. Ask all of these questions. Also, I will let Lance and Spiros introduce themselves in a second, but both of these guys were students at Coding Dojo before they were instructors. Lance actually joined us for a really great Q&A a couple weeks ago. So they can answer your questions that you might have, not only about like the technologies that you'll learn at Coding Dojo, but also the experience of being at a boot camp and being at Coding Dojo as well. So use the Q&A app in Hangouts. You can also tweet at Course Report with any of your questions about all of these things that we're going to talk about. So let's get started. So Lance and Spiros, introduce yourselves. Tell us how you got to Coding Dojo, and I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so that everybody can see the wonderful presentation that Lance and Spiros have put together for us.
Sounds great.
Hi, I'm Lance Robertson, and I was a poet and writer, and I wanted to be a technology writer guy, so I came to the boot camp in January and graduated in March, and I started TAing, and I've been training to become a boot camp leader. So I'm an apprentice right now, doing instructing, and that's what brought me to the boot camp.
Yeah.
Cool.
Awesome. Hi, everybody. My name is Spiros. Also one of the instructors here at Coding Dojo. Yeah, before Coding Dojo, I feel like it's been a lifetime ago. I used to be actually into sales and leadership, and that was great and all. But once I got into web development, like it's been another 10 years into it. But yeah, I'm really excited. One thing to point out too that I guess it wasn't on my bio was I'm really passionate about security also. So kind of like each instructor here has kind of their own little like niche that they kind of like. My thing is web security, so I'm really passionate about that as well.
Is that something that y'all incorporate into the Coding Dojo like curriculum, security?
Yeah, we absolutely are. We're actually I'm building right now a security course for us, and kind of reaching out to a lot of the resources because there's just a lot of things you can teach about security. We can do like a full course at some point, perhaps actually. But right now we're doing all of the essentials that people should know when they code, essentially. So.
Awesome. Very important. Okay, cool. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so y'all can see this presentation.
Great.
Okay, so this is obviously Lance and Spiros, Coding Dojo instructors. Those are their emails there.
Yeah.
That's good. That's good.
Awesome. So we want to start with this quick glossary. A quick rundown of some of the terms that Lance and Spiros might use in this presentation, and remember that Q&A app is there for you, so if there are like words or concepts that Spiros and Lance go over in the presentation that you don't understand, just like let us know, but these are some things that we might touch on. So I will let y'all take this away.
Right. So these are just kind of some high-level things we're going to go over, and we'll start talking about the request and response cycle with the HTTP protocol. That's, you know, when you type in your address in your web browser, HTTP is the protocol. It stands for Hypertext Transfer Protocol, and this is just, it's a specification that describes how web servers talk to web browsers. The client is the web browser, the server is the thing that you're making the request to. So when you type in an address in there, and you hit send, or you type something into on a web page form or something, and you press submit, what have you, it's going to send the request to the server. Server's going to think about it, do its little work, and then send back a response. The operating system is where you is the environment that the programs are going to run in on your computer, or if it's for the server, it's you know, that the server is a program that's running on a computer somewhere, and that's the OS is the environment that it runs in. The web server is a program. It's definitely going to have access to a database, probably, that you're going to be pulling info from and sending info to the clients making the requests. And the interpreter is, well, you're probably going to be writing these programs in some kind of a language. And the language, generally with web development, it's going to be an interpreted language that the server is going to take the commands that are written in the programming language and interpret them and then do something. You know, so if you say, well, talk to the database, grab some info, send it to what they requested. So that's kind of basically the basics of a server. You want to add anything to that?
No, that's it. From very, very high level, it's very little to say, but it does a lot, of course. Yeah.
And then the stack is essentially, when we talk about technology stack, like we're going to talk about, say, the LAMP stack. LAMP, you know, it encompasses the whole stack of the server, from the operating system it runs on to the actual web server program to the language that, you know, you write the sort of the programs for your web app in, and then the database technology that you're using. And then even you can go even further into what's actually, you know, you can have on your side of the program, like when you're running something on the web browser, on the client side, there, you know, there'll be some technologies there at work too. So that's the kind of the full stack, from the front end to the back end, which includes the database.
Can you explain what the client side means?
Sure. The client side and the server side that's sort of your split that you have there. So perfect. On your side, you have your computer and your web browser, and the web browser is a client of the server, and the server is what's running on the back end. So when you type in Google, you know, it goes to Google's servers, and then it's going to come back with your results. So that's what client refers to, as just your browser, basically.
Got it.
And a framework is basically, I mean, it's sort of a collection of libraries, and also a kind of when you're making a project, this is how you kind of explain it. Is when you make a project, you're going to have different parts of your project and things that, different features and parts of it, what they do. You might have different folders that they go into, so you can kind of keep everything organized in a certain way. And along with that organizational structure, you might have different libraries that you're going to use that people have already built for many common functions that you might need, that lots of people would use. So those become things that get reused a lot, and they end up being developed into libraries. And that's basically what a framework is a collection of those things. Cool. And so a full stack developer is a person who not only works on just the web design, the design of the pages that you would see in the browser on the client side, but they also know how to write the logic on the back end, that when the client makes requests to, say, the server that they want to get certain info from a database or something, then they know how to write that software as well, and also how to talk to the database and string it all together so that from the whole request to the response all the way back cycle, they know how to do all the pieces involved in that.
Very cool.
Yeah.
All right, I think that's an awesome overview. And then, of course, if people have questions about other words that they've heard, or things concepts that you've heard that you're not quite sure about, just put them in that Q&A app, and we'll try and get to them.
Right.
All right, we're going to dive into these 3 languages.
Excellent. Do you want us to give you a little overview of this before we move forward?
Please, yeah. That'd be awesome.
So in very, very quick, the LAMP stack, as you guys see there, it kind of follows the letters. Linux is kind of the OS that is essentially used, but another word we call it is AMP stack, because you can use Linux, you can use Mac, you can use Windows, so LAMP stack, MAMP, or XAMPP, I guess we say for Windows, but Apache being the web server, SQL being the database, of course, and PHP being the interpreted language. Talk about mean stack real quick. MongoDB is the database. It's a NoSQL database, meaning that it is a non-structured database, which is different fundamentally from SQL. And then we have, just to reiterate real quick, we have the Node, which is the web server, kind of like Apache would be. And then Express and Angular are 2 different frameworks. We talked about frameworks where it's essentially a structure of files and folders and also libraries. Express is the back end, I guess you say the server-side framework, and that and so we have Angular also, which is kind of like a new, very, very hyped up and very good front-end JavaScript framework. And then lastly, Ruby on Rails, which this is where I'm talking about, where it's not a one-to-one relationship. Ruby is the language, Rails is the framework, but of course Ruby on Rails uses a lot more than just the language and the framework, right? It still has a web server used on it, and it still has
Rails has its own. It has a server, and it has a database sort of aspect to it.
Exactly.
Yeah, so is the database sort of rolled up into Ruby or Rails, or how does that work?
Not necessarily on Ruby on Rails. Ruby on Rails has its own built-in database, but it's the stack on Ruby on Rails, I guess. I don't know if there's any particular one that they use.
Yeah, by default it includes a SQL type database called SQLite, but you can also plug in other kinds of databases in it, and the Rails framework itself kind of has hooks so that whatever database you want to use with it, there'll be a library you can pull in that will talk to it.
The little configuration.
Yeah.
A little configuration. Asterisks. But yeah, actually, absolutely. They're very flexible. Yeah.
Okay, cool. That's a great breakdown. So we're going to start with LAMP stack.
Right.
Yeah.
So
I guess it's just a little bit of pros and cons on LAMP stack, or perhaps even why. As you guys see on there, not to reiterate what we wrote on there, but the reason why we say low barrier to entry is because in the LAMP stack, in PHP, it's one of the very few languages where you can actually build out a website, essentially procedurally, meaning that you don't need a framework to load pages. So it's actually something where in Coding Dojo, it's the first stack we teach because of that reason, because you don't need to use a bunch of helpers and libraries and things like that to make something work. And that's really good fundamentally to kind of understand how things work. Great documentation, essentially, because it's so old and there's so much support.
Right. All of these technologies, Linux, Apache, MySQL, PHP, I mean, they're all kind of descendants of maybe earlier technologies, but in particular, those things started to come together basically in the mid-90s. I mean, it's a mature platform, basically. So that means it's well documented. There's lots of guides and manuals and stuff to refer to, and also a large community that comes along with that.
Yeah, that's big. If somebody's looking for their first language and considering PHP, another reason why it's so good is because it's a large community. So a lot of the questions you will have, thankfully, you'll be able to find the answers online. Whereas something like the mean stack, for example, which is innately newer in relative to the LAMP stack, there are not that many questions out there. There are, like, say, LAMP stacks questions, so it is easier to find questions to get yourself unstuck.
Right.
So,
yeah, that's something that we hear a lot about, is when a language has really great documentation or really strong communities around it. But on the flip side, that can mean that it's really hard to find trustworthy information, I guess. What are some of your favorite when you think about PHP and LAMP stack? What are the best resources that you've found when you can't figure something out?
Yeah. Yeah, I think unanimously. I mean, there is of course the documentation of PHP, which is great actually.
Yeah, PHP.net, the official manual.
In this case, it's great. Not all cases, but in PHP's case, it's great.
Right.
However, Stack Overflow, as everybody out there that has done search on any kind of line of code, they'll look up Stack Overflow. The reason why that's really good is because people will vote up and down those answers and the questions. So, you know, 30, 40 people that have voted up an answer, it's likely that's actually an accurate answer.
All right. The only thing you got to watch out with that usually is, you know, how old the information is, because sometimes they might be talking about an earlier version or something. And so there's quality issues and also timeliness issues there.
Sure.
But generally, you can do a little digging and you can find good answers there.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay, and then it says it's the OG stack. How old?
Yeah, that's right.
We added that purposely.
How old is PHP?
It's really, all these technologies sort of started coming together. I mean, you know, Linux was developed, I think the earlier versions came out in like 91. PHP kind of started coming together by 97. MySQL as a product, I think, came out in 95. Apache was, I think, by the late 90s that was going. So all those technologies started kind of coming together at that time, and then so that kind of really sort of defined what a web development stack is. You know, this whole idea of LAMP stack kind of coalesced there, and then over time people started kind of, you can swap out different parts of those technologies, like Speros was saying, like you don't have to run it on Linux. You can run it. There's a WAMP, there's MAMP if on Macs, you know, WAMP of Windows or different ones. But then that kind of, you know, people started saying, well, that's a whole stack. I mean, why don't we can replace all of those things with different things and create whole new stacks. So that's kind of why we kind of jokingly put it's the OG stack there. It's the kind of the original web dev stack there.
Yeah, and just to note, the right side that you guys see on the technologies and options, that's actually that's kind of off our website as far as like what we teach, because the LAMP stack on its own, just learning, you know, Apache Works, MySQL, and PHP is really not going to be enough to be a web developer in the LAMP stack. A lot of things that you see on the right there were purposely chosen because with that knowledge in mind, you could build a full website. Right.
Awesome. What kind of companies use LAMP stack or are built on PHP?
Oh, that's right. I think the biggest one is Facebook. They started on PHP, and although they've also migrated to other technologies as well, they still are really pushing the limits of what PHP can do. I mean, one of the things is, since there's kind of, in programming, there's a difference between, they talk about compiled versus interpreted languages. And older programming languages were all pretty much compiled. It means that the computer has to check everything in the code that you wrote and make sure that it is in the right format and the syntax is good before it'll actually run. But interpreted languages are they go through an interpreter, and the interpreter is going to read each line as it's executing them and along the way. And so one of the sort of the trade-offs with that is that an interpreted language isn't as fast as a compiled language, and PHP is an interpreted language. But Facebook, they needed to see, you know, greater performance as they scaled up, and so they've actually created their own extension kind of PHP called Hip Hop, where it takes PHP code and turns it into code that can be compiled on the fly, so that they've able to get a lot of performance gains out of that. Other sites, I know Tumblr was originally written in PHP, and then also just it's very common that many smaller sites use it as well. So
tons of different websites use it.
Ones that you might not have heard of, but there's a ton of them out there.
Most popular, I think, language.
Yeah. WordPress too, right?
Yeah, WordPress is built in PHP. Absolutely. That's right.
Cool. Awesome.
So yeah. I think
that sums it up.
That's good.
Did anybody have any questions about that? Or?
Right.
Let's check to see if anybody has any questions. Okay, so Kevin has a question. What do you say to people that say PHP is dying and that Node is killing it?
Yeah,
do you think it will remain in the Coding Dojo curriculum for much longer?
Well, you know, there is a kernel of truth to that, in that it's definitely, since it's such a mature technology, and it's starting to sort of show some limitations in performance and those kinds of things. The mean stack node is definitely gaining, and Rails and Ruby have also become very popular with startups and newer technology companies. So if you were going to start a new web app or service or company, you might not necessarily start with PHP. You might choose one of the newer technology stacks to start with. But the thing is, it's still easy to learn, and there still are companies like Facebook that are pushing the limits of what it can do. And also, there's still a lot of work out there for PHP developers. And even if a company wants to take their PHP application and port it over to a newer technology, then that means there's still work for PHP developers.
And knowing both stacks, you become very valuable to that company, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's well said. But most importantly, PHP is a very easy language to learn, essentially, versus the other ones, right? You jump into Ruby on Rails, for example, with the first language, there's a lot of stuff that will happen in the background that you'll feel like it's perhaps either magic, or you'll go beyond and actually learn more about it. But most people will just kind of write the code and kind of believe in the code doing what it needs to do. So.
Absolutely. Yeah, we hear so much about Rails being this sort of the magic of Rails, and so it can be nice to sort of see how things are working underneath the hood first.
Yeah. Right.
Cool. Okay, well, with that question, I think that's a good transition into talking about mean stack.
Absolutely.
Awesome.
Yeah, mean stack. Mean stack. It's awesome. What do we want to talk about? Do you want to bring it up first? Or?
Well,
let's talk about the first big part of mean stack, which is the node server, right? We use Express framework in this case, at least for our school. And one of the biggest things is the asynchronous, the ability to have asynchronous events with Socket.io, and that's kind of giving you the ability to connect, create applications that are very, they're essentially. Things can happen essentially from one client for one user. You can be on the website doing something, and as you update things on your website, you can have every other person on that website see the update live in the moment. Essentially kind of like a chat room. If I type something, somebody will see it immediately. But people are pushing the envelope now with Node, which being a very powerful new stack, where like notifications and things like that. Or maybe if anybody has, this is a perfect example. If anybody has tried to book a plane ticket, and it says like 2 tickets left, and then you click on it and it says sorry, tickets have gone out, right? If you run this with kind of like the node with the node server, essentially, you can make it so that as those tickets go away, users will see it live. So it's like, oh, I have one more, and they can click on it real quick, as opposed to now we have to click and kind of find out that, oh, it's too late,
Right.
So that like real-time capabilities are important. Okay, that's awesome. That's cool. And that's from Node. You're getting that real-time capability from Node. Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
The second bulletin down there, if you guys see, we say JavaScript-based, not Java. Most people know, I think, but some people don't. It's just good to identify that Java language and JavaScript are entirely like apples and pears, or whatever you want to consider them. They're both fruit, but they're like not the same at all in any way, right?
It's definitely a point of confusion, and it was just kind of a weird thing where when JavaScript was being created, they kind of just, Java was the popular, kind of new thing at the time, so they just, it was kind of a marketing reason to call it JavaScript. But it's not Java, but this is a thing about the mean stack is all of these technologies, you use JavaScript to interact with them. So this is kind of a new thing with web development, is that you can actually have your developers just learn one language, and then they're able to write the back-end code, the database code, and the front-end code. And so with this, you can actually have your developers all talking the same language together, instead of having the server-side guys are speaking a different, different programming language.
Yeah,
right.
Exactly.
So that's kind of an advantage in that regard. That might be a reason why you would want to use the mean stack for something. And it's also very fast and scalable. I think a node server can support many, tens of thousands of connections at once.
Yeah, we won't go into the details of how node server works differently, but if you guys Google how a node server works, like the event-based engine and such, it's pretty interesting to see it.
Yeah, and all this stuff, I mean, none of these things really existed if you go back before, like, say, around 2009, these things didn't exist yet. So this is definitely, it's the newest one, and there's trade-offs there. I mean, that means when you go to Stack Overflow, there's not going to be as many answers, or the technologies are evolving and developing so quickly, you might find an answer that's already out of date. So those are kind of potential pitfalls with that.
Yeah, I feel like you hear about JavaScript frameworks just constantly evolving and new ones coming out, and especially like in terms of boot camps, you hear people asking if they're going to be learning all of these different JavaScript frameworks, and new ones.
Right.
Are there at Coding Dojo? Do you typically stick to Mongo, Express, Angular, Node, or if there's something new and exciting, like would you spend time working on that or teaching that, or
we tend to focus on these particular technologies, but even in the course of within the last few months, we are continuously updating the kind of the platform, because the technologies themselves are changing.
We update things almost daily at times. But that's part of the reason of we find different ways of teaching things better, and we just have the ability, because we're such a flat organization, we're able to kind of make calls as we go, and that kind of makes it so that we can actually teach 3 full stacks in 12 weeks, right?
But we think these are definitely good starting places. You can totally replace any one of these. They're all kind of built around Node, but you can swap in a different database. You can use a different front-end framework instead of Angular. You can use different back-end framework instead of Express, but really just getting started with these is going to give you the kind of the vocabulary and the experience to be able to go on and learn different ones.
I have to note something real quick. One of the coolest things that we do now with our students is, because they're learning obviously 3 full stacks, the second and third project, we challenge them to run 2 to 3 different servers on the same project. And you don't have to do that, but to be able to say, I have a project, a website that is using a Node server on the back end, as well as a Ruby server, as well as the Apache PHP base server. It's actually really cool, just because then you kind of give more opportunities for them to build whatever they want, however they want.
Like the other stacks might have more mature frameworks for doing more complicated kinds of logics, so you might want to have a more complex app, have parts of it built out in another server, and then you have a Node server as a helper server that can manage the real-time connections aspect of it, or chat or something. So you can kind of piece those things together, and we do have you do that in a couple of assignments.
Cool. It's cool to hear. I think a beginner might not realize that you could run all 3. That these aren't, they don't exist. They're not mutually exclusive.
Right.
You can run them all together. Okay, cool.
Right.
Awesome.
And
you might just say, well, I guess you can talk about who actually is using these technologies.
Yeah.
Please, yeah.
First off, we'll definitely bring up Uber.
They're probably the biggest name out there
awesome.
right now. That they use the Node server for their real-time aspect of their network.
eBay, LinkedIn. Let's see. Let's look at a list here. New York Times. There's a ton more that use it. And again, it's just like Lance said. There's sometimes that they use different features for their website when they use the Node server, not necessarily the entire project or the entire app on the Node server. But being able to know how to do that, and actually it's not that hard if you identify and understand how it works. Just opens up the kind of your doors to create apps that you didn't think were possible, I guess.
Right.
Kind of opens up your horizons.
Very cool. Well, and then in the same way, like you say, Uber, has elements of JavaScript and Node, but is also Uber is a native iOS app, right?
Well,
so
they
like
have
everything.
Android.
They have, depending
cool.
on the app.
So those are like the
Right.
clients, like the apps themselves are the clients for their network, and then at the back end they have, I believe they use Node to manage the kind of the real-time connections aspect.
Absolutely do that, yeah.
Very cool. Okay, cool. I think we've got a question from Liam who says, I'm just gonna, let's see. So, that it seems like JavaScript is sort of known as like a front-end language. What is, how did it like evolve into being a full stack language? And is it better to use for if you have, something that you want, a more like front-end project?
Okay, so I
wanna
guess
field that?
the answer, yeah, the answer depends. Yeah, JavaScript is great. Obviously, a lot of all browsers out there,
Every
within
browser,
reason, they should
much.
know HTML, CSS, JavaScript. And so because of that, knowing JavaScript, everything, even like for example, jQuery is a JavaScript library, right? So learning that and knowing that on the front end, you'll have to use it for essentially anything front end. But now with Node, and I think Ryan Dahl is the one that
Ryan
created it,
Dahl,
right?
that's right. That's how it became a server-side
Right.
language. Is basically he took the JavaScript execution engine that Google developed for their Chrome browser. It's called the V8 JavaScript engine, and he basically ported that over to be a server-side runtime environment for JavaScript. And so using that, he was able to create this web server environment known as Node, and that basically made it possible for never really before could you use JavaScript as a back-end language, but now you can via Node.
Yeah, and there's differences, right? Like on the back-end JavaScript, you can't use an alert, right? But on the front end, of course, you can. So there are differences, but essentially it's the same language. So if you learn one, you kind of have the benefit of you can learn one and you can use that on both sides of the spectrum. But kind of a caveat, keep in mind that JavaScript frameworks are awesome. They can be pretty extensive and pretty intense, like Angular being one of them, but they're very, very powerful. So you kind of have like best of the both worlds, but you will definitely need to put, I think, more time in general into creating those apps with those stacks.
And it also should be noted that, you know, it's not reserved to this stack. Like you can use JavaScript. I mean, you're going to use if you want to add interactivity to your client-side part of the user-facing portion of your app, then you're going to use JavaScript, whether you're on the Mean stack or LAMP or Ruby on Rails. I mean, your JavaScript's going to help you out for doing those kinds of things in the actual browser.
Cool. Okay, while we're still on Mean stack, Tony has a question. What are your least favorite things about Angular?
It's very complex. You know, there's actually a pretty steep learning curve, and that's kind of the thing. I mean, I don't want to really frame it too negatively, but it's just that's the trade-off, right? It's like it's very powerful, and you can do a lot with it. You can add a ton of customization to it, but it takes a lot of effort and time to ramp up to that, you know.
Yeah, exactly. It's complex, but I mean, I would say there's just a lot into it. So, I don't know if there's any. I guess there's not too many applications out there online that you can just go there and be like, hey, let me see a full Angular front-end app working where it can document every part of it and tell me exactly what it's doing. You can't really find that, right? I mean, we create that structure here at Coding Dojo, so it's easy for you to do it, but you look elsewhere out on the web because it's so new, and Angular 2 is coming out, right? So then, like, what's that all about? How is that different? So I guess documentation for Angular is great, but full-fledged applications where you can take it as somebody that's learning and kind of try to break it down on your own, that's going to be a little more difficult than most things, I think.
Right.
Yeah. So I guess that would be it.
Okay. Cool. Awesome. Sweet. So let's move into Mean stack.
Ruby.
I'm sorry, Ruby.
That's right.
Ruby.
All right. Cool. Sweet.
Yeah.
So this is the one that we hear about the most with boot camps, especially. Although
really hot right now.
It's so hot right now. So yeah, give us the rundown.
Quick thing about Ruby. You can talk about it. Feel free to talk about it. There's one thing that I'm very against. I love Ruby. I'm all about Ruby. What I'm always against, and I was telling what to do is when you think of something in Ruby being done that you feel like it's magic and you don't know what's going on in the background. That's bad, right? That's really bad. Like you shouldn't start a language and use gems, which we'll talk about in a minute here, libraries, and not know what they're doing in the background. Because when something breaks and you don't know how that's done, then you're not really a developer. You're more like a typist, I guess, or like somebody that just kind of puts things together. So if you want to become a true developer where you can actually develop applications to move forward, when you get into Ruby on Rails, the reason why we choose to use it as the last stack is we don't want anything that is done as a shortcut to be magic to anyone. And I think anybody that is learning Ruby on Rails, it's a phenomenal language, phenomenal Ruby language, phenomenal Rails framework in very, very many ways. But but do your research. Don't just use these shortcuts and just take them for granted. Yeah, so I get off my soapbox, I guess, and
No, that's
hand it
great.
off.
No, that's so fair.
Yeah.
You hear so much about the magic of Ruby, and I
That's
think
not good. Yeah,
really
It's good. It's great once
The
you
magic of
already,
Ruby, yes.
when you know the fundamentals, then it's nice to be able to, to kind of lean on some of those features where it takes care of like things that are kind of a pain to have to do manually all the time. Once you already know how to do them, once you can't really.
You can appreciate it more.
Yeah, you can appreciate it, and then if something goes wrong, then you can kind of actually know how to step in there and start trying to debug things and find what the issues are. But other than that, I mean, it's once you kind of got to crawl before you walk kind of thing.
Yep.
So we'll talk a little bit about it. Ruby, of course, Rails being the framework, just like we talked about, it's a library. We can sort out all the files and kind of like structure for the files and have a bunch of libraries. The libraries are actually referenced as gems. So when somebody says, I added a gem on my Ruby on Rails app, they're essentially saying, I added a library that somebody made out there. It's one and the same. There is this really cool added on kind of like database language called Active Record, which it does have a steep learning curve, I would say, if you don't have like the right place to learn or the right tutorials, but it's awesome. It allows you to pretty much write 3-4, I mean, we'll talk about SQL. SQL, you can write 3-4 lines of code to pull up data from the database that maybe is from like multiple tables or from multiple parts of your database. In Ruby, you can make it so that 3 words essentially can replace that, like three lines of code in SQL. So just like Ruby, and just like Rails in general, is one of these that we talk about. There's a lot of shortcuts. Everything's kind of like you can build things as you go very fast. That's also true with a database by using Active Record. And Active Record actually is moving, I think, into quite a few other places beyond just Ruby right now. But I think that's the one that first.
It has a great way of kind of abstracting away the lower level database commands, so you can actually write some code in an Active Record kind of syntax, and then if you switch database technologies later on, then if you didn't use too specific of database-specific kind of queries, then a lot of your code would still work, even if you totally swapped out a different database technology.
It's like the jQuery of JavaScript. It's like Active Record is like jQuery is JavaScript. Anyways.
So yeah, and Ruby itself, it was kind of developed specifically to please programmers. It was developed in the 90s to kind of have a lot of it's pretty sweet, as they talk about this concept of syntactic sugar, which are just kind of ways of making the programming language more human readable. It doesn't actually change how the programming language works, but it gives you kind of shortcuts and clarifying ways of interacting with the language that make it more human readable.
Yeah.
And that's kind of part of the reason why we don't recommend it as the first thing, but it's also kind of why we teach it last, I guess, because
Absolutely.
You go through all of these previous steps to learn the fundamentals, and then you can appreciate those things.
Yeah.
Got it. Awesome.
And yeah.
What kind of, you hear a lot that startups are built on Ruby on Rails. Is that what you sort of still see, or do you see it being used by larger, like more enterprise-y type of companies? Or?
Yeah, I would say holistically, I would say startups, and the reason why is if you become I'd say good Ruby developer, absolutely become a good Ruby developer. If you do a lot of Ruby, you start to learn the Ruby ways, and a lot of the Ruby ways is lines of code. They will lean on gems. They will write a lot of the code for you.
Mm-hmm.
So to take an idea from idea to prototype, Ruby can do that actually quite fast, quite quickly.
Rapid development.
Yeah.
So that's why a lot of startups are into it, I think, because it makes it faster to go from your concept to execution. And a lot of, like, Twitter, I think, was originally developed on Rails. GitHub is the major kind of code. It's sort of like it's become almost the de facto portfolio for developers to show their code and share their code and manage projects together. That's built on Rails. A lot of
Coupon.
newer sites,
Airbnb.
Groupon, Airbnb, Indiegogo, looking at
Cool. Cool. Okay, so that is a wonderful introduction to those three languages. And we have a couple questions about projects. And I know that we are going to get into some actual student projects in just a minute. So I'm going to hold off on asking those for now.
Okay.
Do we want to go into full stack development in general? Coding Dojo teaches all three of those languages. Why do you teach all three?
Yeah, absolutely. Are we on the slide? We're on the slide. Awesome.
Yeah, yeah.
So, so full stack development by itself means that, just like Len said earlier, you can build every aspect of the app. So here's the thing: innately, when you look for jobs after you get into web development, you'll find jobs that either are very narrow or they're very wide in spectrum, right? Wide in spectrum, you have a lot more responsibility, but you can also kind of build on the entire stack, meaning that you can go from the front end all the way to the back end to the database. And then usually with larger companies, that scope is reduced by a lot, where you just kind of work on this one particular area. To each their own. Some people love to begin in large companies and get really good at particular areas. Mm-hmm. Some people love to be in small companies where they can kind of have more control, kind of be the architect of the project. They both have their advantages. Of course, we and I think a lot of bootcamps believe that a full stack developer, a well-rounded developer, is the best kind of developer to have, because they don't have to stop where the database starts and say, hey, there's an error on your side. I don't know what's going on there, but just let me know when you're done with it. They can actually follow through it and fix the entire process, so that also when you're a developer in a large company and you need to talk to the database guys, you know exactly what's going on. You're not going to be clueless. You're going to be like, oh yeah, I know, I get an idea. I mean, I'm not going to be like expert like they are, but I know exactly what they're doing and how they're doing it.
I mean, people go through, like here, some of the students we have right now, I hear them talking about, you know, I'm going to go into front-end development. I'm going to be a user interface, user experience guy.
Find out.
But even so, it's still good to know how to, you know, if you're going to be working with the back-end developers, you know how to talk their language, you know. So that's one of the advantages of getting the training in the full stack, even if you're not going to be a full stacker, like you say, even if you're going to be in a larger company where you might just own a smaller piece of the project, but you still know how to talk to the other aspects. And the other thing about that is, we really emphasize not just, like a lot of places are just going to say focus on Rails or something, but we kind of get you to look at multiple technologies, because technologies are going to change over time, and you will have to learn something new at some point. You know, that's a given. That's guaranteed. So you want to be able to learn the fundamentals and how to do things in one stack, and then you take it to another technology and you learn how to do things in that one, and then by the time you're doing, you know, 3 stacks, you're kind of starting to see what's common in all of them, and then it's not about learning a specific programming language. It's about learning the fundamentals of programming that are going to apply to any programming.
Yeah, but we're very passionate about that here at Coding Dojo, because having gone to the program ourselves, and the biggest thing that I think I like about what we do is we'll have one particular assignment that you'll do on all 3 stacks. So you see it built on PHP and how kind of like information moves back and forth, and you see the same process in mean stack, and you see the same process in Ruby on Rails, so you can really identify how things relate to each other. So then once you have the fundamentals understanding of how development works, going into Python Django, no big deal. I mean, function will be the same, if and else statement is going to be the same. There are going to be some differences that you'll see here and there, but we actually had a student, Jeffrey, that was looking at jobs and after Coding Dojo, and he was saying, you know, he's like, oh, I'm looking to possibly do this other stack and I'm not familiar with it. It's like, you know, Python. What is that like? We're like, well, it's kind of like, you know, kind of like PHP, not to get anybody mad out there, but it's kind of like PHP and kind of how it works. And then Django, what's an MVC framework? And he's like, oh, well then no big deal. I got it. You know, and it was just so amazing to see somebody that came in with zero knowledge to be graduate, and then as a graduate, you say, oh, you know what, I'm going to a 4th stack, no big deal. It's going to be the same.
We've seen companies say, you know, we work in Django, Python, but, you know, we hire Rails developers because the transition is not that steep there. So
absolutely.
Right. Very cool. Do you spend the same amount of time teaching each stack at Coding Dojo? Is the full program 12 weeks long?
Yeah. Okay. So exactly, yeah. We're spending a month on each stack, essentially, is what we were doing.
Okay.
Yeah. So.
Awesome.
Yeah, absolutely. I can get more in depth, but I know we don't have enough time, so
Yeah.
I'll just keep my piece.
Well, actually, I had a question. We can move on to this next slide in a sec. Which language is most fun? So you've been through the program, but now you're also both teaching. What's the most fun to teach? Like, which do you find that students like really catch on to quickly, like build really cool stuff with? Have you noticed anything cool about like teaching 3 different stacks?
Yeah.
It's so hard to play favorites, you know.
Yeah.
They're all like your children. You
Well
know,
answered.
you don't want to favor one too much. But and then at that point, it also kind of comes down to personal tastes
And what you're building.
But
That's the
right,
biggest
and then it's like what kind of technology do you want to apply to a certain kind of problem? There's always that whole it depends kind of aspect to it, you know. But I definitely think the newer technologies are kind of exciting in a certain way of like, wow, like these new things are possible, you know. So the mean stack definitely captivates people in that way, that there's just a certain kind of
more challenge, perhaps.
well, yeah, definitely. And then Rails has a lot of and Ruby and Rails particularly, it seems like they're really been designed to just be pleasing to the developer, you know. So it is, by the time you get through the mean stack, which is very challenging in the Coding Dojo program, then you get to Rails, it's almost like a relief that it has so many nice things there to take care of you, you know.
Right.
A lot of people that like the challenge, I think they like the mean stack because essentially every line of code that you have to write every line of code in there, right? Except for the modules, express modules, everything else you have to write out. Versus Ruby on Rails, a lot of it is pre-written, and you just write code for it. So people that are looking for, hey, I just want to challenge myself, and I just want to like have control of everything. I think a lot of people tend to go through mean, perhaps. And then people that are like, I just want to get the job done and build my application or build my company or whatever the case may be, and I don't care for asynchronous type of connections with sockets. They're leaning actually towards Ruby, I think, right?
Yeah. And if you want to get a prototype out there quickly.
Yeah. And this is very general, right? I don't want to tell anyone that's like.
Yeah, we don't want to step into the holy wars there.
Because it's absolutely about what kind of application you're building, and right. So that's going to determine your end result is going to determine what language you use. So it's not like I'm going to say I'm going to build something in mean, and it's going to be this. It's going to be more like I need to build this application. This is the stuff that I need from it, and therefore this is the best language and framework that I'll use for it.
Right. Yeah, I know that's general, but I think it is a very good distinction.
Sure.
Okay, cool. Awesome. Well, you talked about applications. I do want to see some real-world examples. So, actually, first, so what is this graph telling us?
This is just a chart of what kind of, if you look at like kind of keywords out there and job listings and stuff, you know, there's definitely going to be a lot of
in short, what I would say is that like SQL is used for a lot of these languages, right? So we put up there SQL, and we say there's a lot because really you should learn SQL, because if you know SQL and you're doing full stack development, either you're doing Java or JavaScript or potentially even C#, Python, C++, Ruby on Rails, they're all going to use, or most likely use SQL, and that's why that's high up. But I wouldn't stop there in any way. I wouldn't say that I need to go out there and just learn SQL and then have a lot of opportunities. I would more say that whatever language I learn, I need to make sure that I also know SQL, because those two are likely going to go hand in hand together.
Cool.
Yeah.
Sweet. Okay, cool. We're on student demos.
Great.
So, Spiros, do you want to share your screen?
Absolutely. All right, cool. So we picked out just 3 projects that we kind of just grabbed. This one actually was a PHP-based project, if I'm not mistaken. Yep. On the far left here, you'll see what is like the type project is PHP, Ajax, MySQL, jQuery, JavaScript. This is something that the students actually built on week 6. And it was essentially a project that was similar to just like an e-commerce. We're selling products, but the really cool thing about this app is that, for example, here they had similar items that you could query depending on their algorithm that they created. Different, pictures for those. There's like the shopping bag, shipping information, bill information, credit card, and such. Here is, I believe, the orders dashboard for the admins, if I'm not mistaken. There is just another view of just products view. There's more of it right there, and then more of it right here. This is where I can edit. So they're actually, who was this? This was Kendall, and who else was there in their group? I don't recall.
That was before.
I'm so sorry if they see this.
But yeah, you got a whole, basically, a whole end-to-end solution for e-commerce kind of stuff here. You know, it's like you have the user-facing portion of it, and then the admin can go in and track the orders and can check out, you know, can add new products. And this is kind of being able to build something like this. You know, this means you're going to be able to, you know, provide this kind of solution for maybe a, you know, a small business or what have you. You know.
Yeah.
Very
Off this, should we go next one?
And that was built in
That's
PHP,
like a
JavaScript.
project.
Okay, that was a LAMP project. Okay,
Correct.
awesome.
PHP, JavaScript. We have it here on the left side, actually, if they want to see the URLs right there. Ulysses also was part of this project, actually, I believe.
Cool.
Anyways, so there it
That's
is
a cool
right there.
site to be able to see, sort of like a demo site.
Yeah, I think this is particularly Ulysses' website where he's got like all the projects.
This is a portfolio
This is one of them.
page.
Exactly.
That's a cool portfolio. Oh, I love that.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. The next one, which is equally as cool, is Tien actually made this website. This is actually really cool. Oops, excuse me. This is actually something you use Node for, and
This is a mean stack project.
mean stack project, right? And he actually integrated what's it called? Fitbit, the Fitbit API. So actually, I logged in here. I think I'm still logged in. There it is. There's Tien.
We're looking at his actual Fitbit data here.
Right,
from
how he
his
slept last night.
activity tracker on his little wearable device, and he has all these great kinds of graphs that he built with the JavaScript library D3.js, which is designed to show you all these. It's designed for data visualization, basically.
This one.
Yeah, that one.
There we go.
This one, yeah, there you go. And it has all these dynamic charts, so you can actually look at the data from your. You can plot different kinds of things on the XY axis here for how you slept, or here's tells you how much time you spent sleeping restfully, or if you were tossing and turning, and so on.
Yeah.
So you know, he really put a lot of work into this, and it actually. It's not really the most simple thing in the world to be able to pull all this information from an API.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Very cool.
And
do y'all cover APIs pretty extensively at Coding Dojo? Okay, cool.
Actually, one of them that we started covering recently, which is really awesome, is the Uber API. So it's really cool that people can actually use the Uber API and just like create, you know.
They're actually doing a hackathon at the San Jose location. And I think when is it?
This weekend.
Yeah,
they're doing an Uber hackathon. So just all the students
so
are
over
building.
The weekend, they're going to have a certain amount of days to just build an app as quickly.
48 hours.
Yeah, 48 hours.
So this one here, actually, it's on a loop. This is also on the website. This is on a loop, so it's kind of showing what it's doing. This is on the. Excuse me. So the first one we talked about was week 6. The second one, I believe, is week 9, and the third one here is their capstone project for this particular student. I think Ulysses and Sarah that did this project. And what they actually built is they built a gem for Ruby on Rails, for the Rails framework, right? So this gem called Make, actually, you can go on there and look it up, and you can download the gem that they made and use it. And what it's used for is you can kind of use this app and use their method that you see right there. Oh, just kind of went past. To decide what tables I want to generate, and it'll generate tables for you, and it'll also generate tables that have data for you, kind of like you see right there. So that's really unique because they actually created a gem that developers use, right?
They basically made their own plugin for the Rails framework to do something that we all kind of have to labor over at times, where you're going to pull information from the database and then you have to display it in some tables on a web page, and so it's kind of a hassle to have to actually write out those tables by hand every single time you're going to do it. So they created this plugin that essentially automates that process for you, which is really, really cool.
It's also so cool to see, you know, instead, you know, they're going from like consumers of technology to like being on the back end, but then, you know, contributing back to the community, which is really awesome.
Absolutely.
I love that.
Exactly. Completely free, of course, open source. They have their code online, and actually this is a part where you can actually kind of put together visually all of the commands you need to do, and it will give you exactly like the table you want.
That's so cool. That's awesome. Okay, so we're running a little bit over, but
Sure.
Spears and Lance, are you able to stay on for a few more minutes to take some of these questions?
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely.
If you are, that's awesome. If you are watching this and need to hop out, that's totally cool. We will publish the recording of the video afterwards.
Sure thing.
Do you want to go back to the video?
Yeah, we can just look at each other now.
Stop this.
Sorry.
No,
I get carried away, as you can tell.
Are we back now into the?
Yeah, we're back.
Oh,
Okay.
great.
Okay,
Right.
so one of the questions that we got about the projects particularly, and since we just looked at some, this person's curious to know if there is a certain stack that Coding Dojo students gravitate towards when they're creating their final project. Is it fairly evenly split, or are certain ones significantly more popular?
For the final project, you can pick whichever stack you want to do it in, and but generally we kind of have it structured so you're doing Ruby at the end of the program, so it's kind of natural to sort of work in that stack because that's the one you've most recently learned. But if you really had a passion for some kind of feature that like the mean stack gives you, or if you already had an idea for something that would work well with the LAMP stack, then maybe you could go back to that, and that's just fine, you know. But either way, I think you can choose which one you want to do it in.
In my experience, I think it's been like 60-40-ish, where most do Ruby and the rest do kind of like the mean project. But we kind of push the envelope with them, and we tell them we challenge them to use both. So it's like if you use Ruby on Rails, make sure you add a mean element to it.
Cool. Has anyone like gone totally off the deep end and done used a technology that you have not taught? Like you were talking about somebody taking a job in Python. Like has anyone been like, oh, I want to do my final project in Python? No.
Not yet. No.
They're learning enough, I feel.
There's so much to learn. There really is. It's pretty.
Okay, cool. All right, Lisa asks, how important is it to know iOS or Android development?
That's the most important thing.
Oh, sorry, did we just
I'm sorry, cut out. Yeah, I'm sorry. You went real quick there for a second.
Okay, so Lisa wants to know, how important is it to know iOS or Android development, mobile development, in addition to full stack web?
I think we can kind of separate those. Well, there's two things. One, iOS and Android will be native apps for the iPhone and iPad and things like that. The other thing you got to keep in mind too is there's a lot of engines out there that will take your code and convert it or put it around a wrapper so that it actually runs on a Android phone or an iPhone. So that allows students and people to build things in the LAMP stack, the mean stack, the Ruby on Rails stack, and then actually still have it on like the iPhone or have it on the Android phone. So
you want to your app. You might not necessarily have to write a native iOS app or an Android app if you are a web developer. But if you are going to write those kinds of apps, then you probably would have a web service on the back end that those apps would talk to. So you would want to know the web development piece of it.
Okay, cool. Okay, last question is from Tony. It's a little bit specific, so we'll see. Tony says, what is your process for debugging in Rails, given that our spec is used by several companies? Is TDD, test-driven development, something that you'll be introducing to the curriculum?
Yeah, absolutely. We actually introduced it pretty early on, actually. And I think very recently we were making some adjustments because we feel that maybe the Sinatra framework maybe kind of like the first one we'll be using. But I guess it depends. We talk about just test-driven development. We do use it, and we will use it, but we also want people to understand how to debug with perhaps even without TDD. So if you talk about debugging the actual code, it kind of depends. We have, like for example, the way I teach it is we try to kind of go step by step through the process. So not to get too far detail in code, but if you go from like a controller that's instantiating a model or from a particular route to controller, we kind of go step by step and make sure that each part of your code it's moving forward and everything's like successful. And if it's not, you know that your issue is between here and here, right? And I think actually a lot of us do that kind of process. I think innately we do it where the negative or the way you wouldn't want to do it is kind of build out your application, like write 15 lines of code and then try to run it, and then you're like, oh, it broke somewhere, and then you're like, well, where did it break? I don't know. Should we use TDD for it? Should we do this? Should we do that? So TDD is great, but keep in mind, TDD in general in projects takes usually like 50 to 60% of the time of the entire web development time frame, right?
Right.
So if it's worth it to use TDD for the project, considering it's going to take you 50, or in this case, it will take you double the amount of time to build that same project, that may work really well. But depending, if it's your startup and you really need that amount of accuracy to use TDD, depending on the time, the allocation, the money that you have, just depends on who's using it. If it's just
We
a project,
definitely have material available to students targeting TDD because it is
our spec,
it's totally essential to know about when you get out into the workforce. So.
Yeah. Does Coding Dojo give, in order to get in, like during the application, do y'all give a coding test as part of the interview of the application, and is that in a specific language or pretty general?
So we give out a coding challenge, but with that we have algorithm.codingdojo.com, which is a free app that we use, and all it does is allows you to just learn how to do algorithms. You can use that and to get the coding challenge. The coding challenge is a few algorithms. It's in JavaScript, and it's just be able to get people to understand the fundamentals, the very basic fundamentals of conditional statements, if and else statements, loops, while loops, for loops, and perhaps modifying strings, modifying arrays. Like those are really like the core basics. From there, once you get to the bootcamp, we can really push off from there. I guess a little snippet that I would say for anyone that wants to get into development, mostly they want to get into boot camps, be certain that you have passion around development, because if you're doing this for the money, because you hear that you can get a lot of money through these boot camps, you will hate your life probably for the 3 months and you will quit. There's no way you can go through this program not liking to develop. The other one is focus, being able to stay focused and not have any external like distractions. And lastly, it's a great attitude going into it. So.
To definitely love solving problems.
It's fun.
Cool. Well, okay, I'll make sure that we include that link to algorithms.codingdojo.com, right?
Yeah, it's helpful.
For people to look at. Algorithm. Okay, cool. For people, I think that we've learned from this webinar, why Coding Dojo teaches those 3 stacks, and in that specific teaches in that specific order. But for somebody who is, maybe like just getting started, is going to teach themselves a little bit, before they apply for Coding Dojo or another boot camp, what do you have any suggestions on like which language they should start with, or even more specific than that, like resources that you suggest that they start with?
Yeah. For me, I would say JavaScript is a great language to learn and start with. There's a lot of websites out there. Some of the ones that I know have been helpful in the past, like Code School, Code Academy, those have been pretty popular. And for what they do, they're very effective, right? You can't go to them expecting to learn how to build a full app. That's not really their purpose. But for learning just like the syntax and how things kind of like flow together, they're a great resource. We have no affiliations to them, so I'm not saying that I'm not promoting them or anything, but they have helped students, so I think that's great. But I would say JavaScript. Yeah. It's
definitely good to learn for just adding that kind of interactivity to web pages and stuff.
Sure.
I mean, she can learn your basic web design kind of stuff with HTML and CSS, and then JavaScript to start adding them, making them more dynamic, but then also PHP is decent to start learning on, because it's very easy to just install a single package that will have the whole web server and database and interpreter and everything in one thing. Like if you have a Mac, just install MAMP and start writing server-side code right away. With JavaScript, you have to kind of get into Node if you want to start building server-side on the back end.
On the front end, it's
With the front end, all you need is a browser. I mean, you can open up the developer tools in your Chrome right now and start typing JavaScript into the console.
Start immediately.
Yeah.
Sweet.
Right. Console log hello world.
That's right.
Okay, everyone go do that. Next steps. All right, y'all, that was such an awesome rundown of all 3 languages. We obviously went over time-wise, but I think that's totally fair given how much, how much we had to cover. So thank you so much for joining everybody who tuned in, and then thank you so much to Lance and Spiros. We can't thank you enough for being here. You've both been wonderful in introducing us to these 3 languages. I'm going to post links to this recording, to this presentation as well that we used to teach during this webinar. And then I'll also include contact information for Coding Dojo and links to those student presentations that we got to see in the webinar. So just to wrap up, visit Course Report, reach out to us on Twitter, on Google+, and Facebook. Let us know what you'd like to see in the next live Q&A or webinar, and we will see you at the next one. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Liz.